Good afternoon and welcome back to Dynamics 365 Finance and Operation, and we are talking about human resources. If this is the first time you have pondered upon this video and you want to learn about the human resource module within the Dynamics 365 and IT space, I believe you have come to the right place. What I would like you to do is to first look into the first few videos that I've created in regards to the configuration piece, because these videos will talk about the processes. We've moved upon the part where we've configured the system. We've talked a lot about how you configure the human resource parameters and some of the things that are required for the module to be functionable. And at this point, we can start talking about the processes. And in my eyes, the processes are very important, which is what makes an ERP system very difficult to implement, especially when it comes to complicated processes. No ERP system will accommodate a process or series of processes for a particular client. So that is why having a good knowledge about the product itself, having good knowledge of understanding the processes really helps with the ERP implementations. So if this is the first time you stumbled upon this video, I do encourage you to go look into some of the previous videos that I've created where we start talking about the configuration and some of the insights that I've given you from my personal experience on how you should navigate and how you should converse with your client in terms of the conversation that you should have during your requirement gathering stages. So let's move on to compensation. So this is the topic that we're going to be talking about today. And once again, we haven't configured compensation. So just like I have mentioned in my previous video about the leave of absence, in this, we're going to assume that the compensation plans have been configured. So that's a different topic, a lot bigger topic than you would have anticipated, which could be covered in one video. So it's a series of videos that we will need to create in order to understand how you configure compensation. But in this case, we're going to start talking a little bit about some of the buttons that are available, some of the functionality that is available from a process perspective. So we recently hired an employee called Leo, and we actually haven't assigned him a position yet. So we're going to talk about position at some point and go a little bit more in more detail about that. So Leo has been hired without a position, and the reason for that is because we simply wanted to use him as an employee to discuss about some of the other things that we talked about in under the work tab and under the person tab. Now, the compensation is actually related to positions. So if you don't have any position, so for instance, Leo, who is not assigned to a position, and I can verify that information for you. If you look into the current positions, Leo is not assigned to any position at all. So you would have seen some of that information here based on what is available in that position itself or what was written in that position, but nothing is here. So no information or no position has been assigned to Leo. Now, the interesting piece here that you should note is that you cannot assign a compensation to Leo because he has no position in the first place, and positions belong to a particular job. So that is the naming convention we're going to eventually talk about once we get into the jobs and positions. But for now, what you simply need to know is that you cannot assign a compensation to an employee without a position. You can always hire an employee, make them active and whatnot in the system, but they will not be paid as long as a position is not assigned to them. In this case, our assumption is going to be that they have been assigned to a position because there's a lot more configuration that goes in order for the position to become active and in order for Leo to be paid or assigned a compensation. But from an HR manager's perspective, we just simply want to know what is the compensation for Leo. What you need to do is go into the form called Employees Active or Active Employees, click on the compensation and look at the fixed plan. So within the fixed plan, this will have a historical columns or rows, in this case, actually historical rows created for this particular employee based on their journey that they had taken in this organization. So Leo, for instance, would have had maybe one or two compensation assigned to them. And And in this case, I'll talk a little bit about the interface that's here, or the UI that you see, just because these will be relevant when we start configuring the system in terms of the compensation. So in this case, cumulative pay rate would be the final, like a total pay that they will get on an annual basis, and the plan itself would be like the compensation plan that we create. We're going to talk about a level, how levels associated with the plan later in the video, but action could be something that they were hired, for instance. So that's something also that we could configure to some extent, but we are limited to a drop-down menu that is pre-built. So you could, always extend it, but I think most of the actions are very relevant, so you shouldn't need to extend it to a different action. So one of the action is like hire or rehire or transfer, things like that. So those are different actions that you can assign here. Nothing that would halt the process. So you don't necessarily need an action, but it's a sort of a required field when you actually assign a compensation. And this is where the position is. So let's see if you can see that the position here is mandatory, so you cannot assign a compensation without a position assigned to that employee. In terms of some of the fields here, the effective date, so the date that they were assigned a compensation, and this is very tricky, to be honest. In my personal experience from the HR implementations that I've done, the effective date always plays a big role. At times, the HR module is so sensitive with these dates that it will drive you crazy. And I will talk a little bit about that experience when we start configuring composition. But the problem here that I've encountered multiple times is that some of the employees that are hired, the way I've hired them actually, without a position, they don't have the effective date right away. What I mean by that is basically that I assign them a position down the road in two weeks from now, for instance. They were active 2 weeks prior, but they were assigned a position 2 weeks after. And then the effective date, for instance, if I wanted to be prior to a position, just maybe a day or few hours, it wouldn't let you. Even though that employee was hired, for instance, 2 weeks from now, say on 14th, for instance, but the system wouldn't allow you to do that because it's also date sensitive, it's also time sensitive. And you would always run into an error. So you would really have to play around with the dates in order for it to get it working. But if you have the configuration correct, of course, if you're following the true process, you shouldn't have a problem with assigning these dates and compensation to an employee. The expiration date usually is never, so it's defaulted because you can only hold one position and then assign a compensation accordingly. The status is usually active because it's an active compensation. Type would be there are different types of compensations. So some are called steps, bands or grades. So all of that can be configured. So it really depends on the business requirements. Pay rate conversion. So it would be in terms of what kind of a pay conversion do you have? So within my organization, we work on a 37.5 hourly basis or on a weekly basis. So that could be a pay rate conversion. Some employees are field workers, so they're on hourly basis. They can be on a 40-hour basis. So that's a conversion that you would need to configure in order to calculate the cumulative pay rate. So that's where these two tie up. Currency, self-intuitive, the annual equivalent, it's the same thing. What would be your yearly basis pay in this case? So it would come from your pay rate conversion, and it would come from your hourly amount that you are earning. And same thing with the monthly, just basically the pay rate times by the monthly equivalent and the hourly equivalent. So all of that you configure within the compensation module. This is the pay rate actually I was referring to. So this could be a specific value, a specific number that is assigned to this particular employee. So if the type is steps, for instance, so in this case, a step 1 would have $15, which would be a minimum wage. So you would see $15. It cannot be edited. So you cannot edit that value once it has been saved and configured. So you'll take that $15 multiply by the payer conversion, you'll eventually get the annual equivalent. You divide that by the monthly equivalent, which would be like 30 or 31 days. All of that is configurable. You get that value, and then at some point, you could get it in terms of the hourly equivalent. So if it's an 8-hour shift or 7.5-hour shift, and based on the configuration and the requirement, you can always get a hourly equivalent value calculated by the system. Increases has to do with, if there was an increase in their compensation. So if there were two rows here, for instance, one row had a fixed amount of $15 and the second row had a fixed amount of $16. So, it will simply calculate the difference. It will see that there is an increased amount of a dollar, for instance. Or if you've configured it in terms of the percentage, it'll give you the increased percent value here. So it just basically gives you a glimpse of the changes and the increments that are taking place for this particular employee in terms of the compensation. A few things we can talk about is the adjusted pay rate. So this kind of comes in terms of, if you're paying somebody in a different currency. So if you have legal entities and employees are being paid in a different currency than your actual current currency within the system, then these guys play a bit of a role into that. Never seen an implementation from my experience, so never had to actually use this. And in terms of ranges, it's the same thing somewhat, just data. What is the minimum range for this particular plan? What is a control point and maximum? So these values are actually configured in the system, and they'll just end up showing up just to give you a glimpse of what that plan and what the plan shows holds in terms of the dollar value. And last piece is financial dimension. So it's like, you need to actually integrate that into the payroll piece itself, and then you can see that it has to be integrated into account structures. We won't really touch on base on it. Don't really need financial dimensions for compensation when you have integration established between the system, FNO system, and the payroll system. So with that, I think we're going to stop today for talking about compensation and fixed plan. We'll talk about the variable plan and what that means in the next video.